Hello, and welcome to everyone who's following our Championing Black Voices series. Collaborations with outside organizations have been a natural extension of Cantus's work, and over the years, we've worked with many notable artistic partners, as well as local artists and organizations within the Twin Cities area. It's through collaboration that Cantus is able to fulfill more deeply our vision to give voice to shared human experiences. In the aftermath of George Floyd's murder at the hands of the Minneapolis police, we felt a responsibility to take an honest look at what anti-racism efforts look like in our own sphere of classical music, and to find ways that we can use our platform to make some difference. With Championing Black Voices, we are working to collaborate with a variety of Black artists, giving them the space to bring to light their lived experiences and artistic visions using our platform alongside our voices. Today, we welcome Dr. Brandon Waddles. Brandon's works have been published and performed by choral ensembles around the globe, including the Morehouse College and University of Michigan Glee Clubs, Oakwood Aeolians, Westminster Choir, Brigham Young University Singers, and the Slovenian Philharmonic Choir. In 2019, he was the inaugural recipient of the ACDA Diverse Voices Collaborative grant. In addition, he has worked as a transcriber of Black gospel music for numerous choral octavos, hymnals, and hymnal supplements published by GIA, including his recent work as a contributing editor for the One Lord, One Faith, One Baptism hymnal. Brandon recently released Just in Case You've Forgotten, the first selected compendium of works by the late Thomas Whitfield, the subject of his dissertation. He's the Director of Choral Activities and lecturer at Wayne State University in Detroit. Welcome, Brandon.
Thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here. As I said to you in a prior conversation, a longtime fan of Cantus, and I am all the more thrilled and enlightened by the opportunity to converse with you.
If my people who are called by my name would humble themselves and pray and seek my face,
I have been, I have to tell you, I think the first time that I listened to Cantus was when I was a high schooler. And I had, this was when CDs were yet a thing, and I had the Deep River CD, and I played it so many times.
Yeah.
So I've been a great fan of this group for a long time, and so I think it's very interesting for me, and I think for all creators as we start at one end of the cycle and then get to the other end of the cycle. And mind you, we're always cycling, so there are always different starts and ends. But just to see how things connect, a conversation such as this, which I never would have expected to have when I was, when I first heard Cantus. Even having been a sophomore in college when I wrote this, we'll talk about why and how and all of that. But, our intentions for our creation are seemingly one-fold in our minds at that point of creation.
Sure.
They branch out in the cycle, and it means something different to somebody else as it moves on, which is one of the reasons, and this is more of a technical thing, when I'm working with different publishers, I very rarely now put any dynamic markings in them, because for creative intention, there's so much that there's something that I've experienced within writing it that I see and hear, but there's more that other creators see and hear when they look at the score to begin to interpret it.
Absolutely. Well, that leaves room not only in the creation, but in its fruition, in how it comes to life off the page. Being able to work on your piece, it was absolutely wonderful to put it together. It was one of my favorite things to put in that concert. And for me, in part, it was the beautiful music and text, but also the way that you use silence in the piece was really stunning for me. And I just kind of wondered what inspired you to write your piece like that?
It's so interesting. I think as creators, we have one idea that comes to mind when initially creating. But as the piece moves on and grows, as it evolves, as we hope that it will, and as others interpret it, there are so many different meanings that evolve from their own mindset. For me, as I was listening to it, after I'd written it, I'd realized that the piece is conversational, and that it is almost as if God personified is writing a letter. And I think about what's going on in my mind. He says, if my people, which are called, so it is a form of stream of consciousness. And so I have told a couple of groups, and this piece seems to have resurfaced. I mean, it's been over 10 years since I wrote this, and it seems now to have resurfaced with a couple of different groups, and I've said it for mixed voices as well.
Oh, great.
And they were asking for a bit of, artistic coaching with it. And I said, I want you to think of it as a conversation. Mm-hmm. And the conversation creates freedom and sort of stretch of tempo. So, the silence leaves room, and there's so much that can be said in silence.
Absolutely.
If there's thought to it, if my people which are called, when I'm trying to get a thought out, especially, if I'm trying to write a paper, think about a dissertation, I'm having to think about what's the best way for me to be able to send this message that the people, if we talk about God personified, what is the best way that my people are going to be able to receive this message? And everything about, whatever religious affiliation that you have or not, even as we think of, as it is written of God, everything that is done is so carefully intended. And so there's a great amount of thought and stream of consciousness that goes into it, even if we think of God as human. So much thought that has to go into every word. And so I've got to take the time when I write it, when I'm speaking it. That's the frame of mind that I have when I think of it now. Absolutely. So there's this sort of conversational, almost personal intimacy that goes into writing a letter, not your dear Joe, but it's something to that effect.
Well, but that does speak to the weight of the piece that it carries on the composer, because what you're describing is excellent. Like that's how people create beautiful art, but you had to think of it from the perspective of a deity. Like he is sitting there, or she is sitting there thinking,
yeah.
and that's part of the inspiration for you. I noticed in the score there's a dedication as well to your mother. Is she at all responsible for this kind of faith-based installation?
Oh, absolutely. I grew up in a very faith-based family, and my mother and father met at church. He was the minister of music. In fact, the church where they met and where I grew up was his very first church job. And she was singing in the choir. She had grown up there as a child. But this church, Carter Metropolitan, CME, Christian Methodist Episcopal, but historically for Black churches, it was known as Colored Methodist. But this church was where I heard my first anthem. It was where I first heard gospel music. It was also where I first heard the spiritual. I can remember their minister of music at that time, and he was had a gorgeous lilting tenor voice, and he would sing "Ain't Got Time to Die." But I experienced so much there in terms of not only my religious upraising, but my musical upraising. And she, of course, we went to church every Sunday that we could, and she sang in the choir. She also played. So I remember this. Now I'm fast forwarding to college, and I had just then decided I want to start really writing in full. I attended Morehouse College, and that gorgeous Glee Club sound just enraptured me. There's something about the closeness and intimacy of the TTBB structure that just allows for sonorities unmatched. To me, I became enraptured by it, and so I was more encouraged to write. And I remember coming home for Christmas or holiday break, and my mother always had this big Bible. All the church homes, as we call it. You got to have a big Bible sitting in the middle of the living room. And so it had always been there. It had been there pretty much all my life growing up in that home. I don't think I'd really ever opened that Bible up until that holiday break. And I sifted through, and I was just looking for any sort of text that would come to me. And that text, it was kind of like you open up, I hate to use this. I open up a spell book, and it immediately just, like hocus pocus, it just goes right to that place. And I was, of course, familiar with the scripture from, a biblical standpoint reading, but I was also familiar with it because I'd heard one of my very favorite gospel singers, Daryl Coley, the late Daryl Coley, do two different interpretations of this. One is more of a gospel ballad, and the other one is more of a contemporary gospel, almost samba-like feel. But he used this scripture in both adaptations. The first one in particular, and it's called Second Chronicles. Daryl Coley, Second Chronicles. But the romantic intimacy and the personalization, the personification of God as man or woman, however you want to see it, was so indicative not only of what gospel was doing at that time. I do a lot of research on contemporary gospel, and it was not only that, but it was so indicative of the intimacy of sonority that I was hearing in the Glee Club with the pieces that we were doing, and it was a perfect mesh. It was a perfect mesh. So it was the first piece that I wrote and had published. And my mother, who remains such an integral part of my life and my faith walk. It was it was built for her, you know?
Well, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
That's really, really lovely. I'm sure your mom's going to love seeing the interview and be like, oh, he said such nice things. Did he say that Bible and witchcraft in the same sentence?
Yeah, she's gonna get on me for that later, but I'll deal with it.
Perfect. I wanted to see if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit more about your musical journey. So there's such a faith base to start with, a beautiful collection of music that comes with faith. And then you went to college and started composing there.
Yeah, so I grew up in church, and I grew up also in a very artistically and culturally minded family. So as I said, my father is a musician, is a trained musician. Still to this day, I'm biased. Best pianist I know, and I spent most of my early years trying to catch up with this guy. And so my musical journey is what I like to tell my students and other people I talk to about this. I refer to it as the zigzag, because everything that I had in mind, it zigzagged somewhere else.
Sure. I get that.
I started off with piano lessons, as many in my family did. And I had in mind, once I had gotten through middle school into high school, that I was going to be a concert pianist. The next, my father, Alvin Waddles, was the next Master Agarich or Vladimir Horowitz, all of my favorites. However, I was not keen on practicing nearly as much as my father or any of those did. So we had to do away with that thought. I got to high school, and my high school choir director, Nina Scott, who is one of my mothers, changed my life completely. I went very begrudgingly into that that basement choir room and never left.
Hey, that's wonderful.
And never left. I remember the first choir rehearsal, the very first piece that we sang in choir rehearsal was Keep Your Lamps Trimmed and Burning, as arranged by Andre Thomas. And I talk about the cycle all the time. Andre Thomas, one of my mentors, it was my major professor at Florida State. Who would have known? But I never left that room. And I became so enraptured with choral music and singing with it, arranging it. That's where I met Stacey Gibbs, one of our most prominent voices. Yeah, Stacey Gibbs.
I love Stacey.
Was a high school student of Nina's as well. So we come from the same line of
very small world.
Very small world. So when Stacey was writing things like Be Still and Know, Lord, If I Got My Ticket, and some of his earliest pieces, I would be there right at the piano with him for a lot of that. So, this just goes to show that point of connection. But voices like his, Damon Dandridge, who was another big brother of mine, but also Adolphus Hailstort, and then Nathaniel Dett. These were the voices that I started to hear, and Moses Hogan, of course. And that was my start. When I got into college, I decided, I'm going to be, the Metropolitan Opera stage, or I'm going to do all of that. Another zigzag.
Sure.
Because, singing just became so stressful for me. I do it, but I only do it when I absolutely have to. And I also hate staging. So, opera was out. And so I decided that by the end of college, now mind you, I started writing in college. That's where I got published. I was in writing, but I had not decided that I was going to fully go into a career in composing. But I had decided at that point that I was going to be the next Dalton Baldwin, or I was going to go into collaborative piano, going to be a voice coach.
Sure.
I still had not studied enough piano.
I wondered if that was going to be a problem that came back for the coaching.
It was the same problem. I just thought, this is fine. No. Some of the same people that, had their majors in piano performance decided that they were going to go into collaborative piano. So I had to compete with them. Anywho, after a very failed private lesson with an amazing collaborative pianist who I will not name, I decided to take a year off. And I said, I'm going to zigzag my way to Westminster. And I said, I have Dalton Baldwin, one of the great collaborative pianists who collaborated with Zeral Sousay and Eli Amelie and Jesse Norman, among others. He was teaching emeritus at Westminster. And I thought this is my time. I'm going to get in and get, coaching lessons with them. Well, mind you, I ended up coming in as a singer. And that zigzagged into me doing more so. My master's was in voice pedagogy and performance. I studied with Sharon Sweet, Metropolitan Opera soprano. And I ventured more into voice coaching. Now, mind you, I've been doing some of this in high school because I still played piano and still accompanied some of my colleagues. So this idea of singers asking me, what is it that you're hearing from me? That sort of ventured me into this realm of voice teaching, voice coaching. And mind you, all of these zigzags, things that I, thought that I'd never use, just all began to gumbo up. This gumbo effect where everything that you brought with you has meaning into the future. I was still writing, but I was doing more so work at Westminster now, particularly in Black sacred music, arranging spirituals. And I'm so grateful for voices like Joe Miller and Amanda Quist and James Jordan and Steve Pilkington and Evelyn Thomas, who encouraged me in this front to bring more of this Black sacred music to Westminster, to this great institution, one of the hallmarks of American choral sound. And they encouraged me to filter, that sound through the Black lens. And I wrote there and I was doing my coaching work there. And when I finished up my master's, there was an opening for the Jubilee Singers for the conductor position. Now, mind you, I had never wanted to even raise my hands to conduct any type of choir. But they saw something in me that I didn't. And I conducted the Jubilee Singers there for 3 years. And at that moment, I think it really clicked for me that teaching and education was supposed to be an integral part of my life journey. And so after the 3 years, I went to Florida State and I worked on my PhD there with Andre Thomas, who I had not even met him by happenstance, maybe more than 10 years ago when I was in high school. I'd met him again when he came to Westminster. I always say that he was the driving force behind one of my most successful arrangements, Ride in the Chariot, which had been premiered at National ACDA in Dallas several years ago. Just interesting because we were supposed to be in Dallas this year for ACDA. But he was my major professor and became a fiery mentor of mine. And as I was finishing up another zigzag, everybody as they're finishing up their doctoral programs is looking for jobs.
Sure.
And nothing was coming up. I mean, rejection letters like you wouldn't believe. And around that time, I was back in Detroit finishing up my dissertation. And I got a call from one of my good friends, Roland Jack, who is an artist manager for a number of artists, Anita Wilson, Tweet, KCJ, but another one, probably the most familiar, is Letticy, who is a several-time Grammy-nominated artist who has worked in R&B and jazz and things of that nature. And I'd met her before, just hadn't worked with her. But we had a conversation that night in Detroit. They happened to be in Detroit that night. He invited me to come and sit with them. And we talked about everything under the sun creatively, from musical theater, Sondheim and Rodgers and Hammerstein, to soul, to jazz. And she said, Roland, is Brandon coming with us? And that's when I started my journey as a music director for Letticy.
Got it. Oh my gosh. And
so I spent the better part of the year after I graduated traveling with her and working with her as her musical director, and mostly doing featured shows that gave tribute to the great Nina Simone. And so we did a number of shows about that. We recently did a taping in Vegas for PBS, which is on PBS now, with Nina Simone, and I'm grateful to be at the piano at the helm for that as music director. But we were finishing up a tour after all of that with Gregory Porter, another jazz artist. And we had finished up the first half, and then the pandemic hit, and everything got shut down.
Sure.
And that's when I got the call about Wayne State. I mean, a week after I got the call about Wayne State, they said, listen, we need someone to come in and really shift things, not only in the choral realm, but in the music ed realm. And we need somebody who's had all of the experiences that you've had. And so I painstakingly go through this zigzag to show everybody that the experiences with literacy and the experiences in music theater and the experiences in jazz and in gospel and the experiences as a writer, the experience as a singer, the experiences as a pianist, were never failures. They built me up to become all the more accessible as a performer, as a creative, as an educator.
I mean, that's incredible. The zigzag aspect is perfectly described. I'm sure that you could speak to a variety of artists, myself included, where the linear path for a musician typically doesn't exist. It's never this line. It's always motion. It definitely travels.
Think about how boring that would be if everything was just a straight line. And I know that we often think about, I just want an easy line. But unfortunately, I will say, that sometimes the work of education and music education is plagued indefinitely by straight line, linear minds that can't get past, this tunnel vision of what music is supposed to sound like or what music education is supposed to look like. And I think, and I know we'll probably talk about this later, but the pandemic has shut that line of thinking down.
Actually, that dovetails really nicely. Happy New Year. It's 2021. But it certainly feels like the 370th something day of 2020 with continued struggles to combat the global pandemic, the political mayhem, and obviously emboldened racism. How has 2020 extension affected you as a musician, as a citizen, and as a Black man in America?
As a musician, I'll tell you, I don't think I've ever been busier. I told Letticy, we were talking maybe a few months in, to the rigors of the pandemic, and she had just finished an album. The PBS show was about to be released. Mm-hmm. I was teaching. I was doing a number of commission works and lecture series. I told her, I said, you know what? I said, we had finished that tour with Gregory Porter. We got sat down, and then I said, we've never stopped running since then.
Wow.
Because artists like Letticy, or PJ Morton, or people within the classical realm who understand the necessity of building your own and creating your own will never go out of work. And there were those of us who had these, either we had the skills or we had connections to the people with the skills to get things done in this new virtual atmosphere, this tech atmosphere. For all of the conductors who have now been trying to figure out Logic and Pro Tools and GarageBand and iMovie and all of that, you have music tech people that have been trained in all of this. And now we're having to collaborate with the people that, in some instances, like I said, that tunnel vision, you thought you never had to look out to do it. It's been amazingly rich for me. That's not at all to say that there haven't been hard times in the midst of it. Those times of like, what the heck am I doing? Mm-hmm. But I have been all the more emblazoned by the connections that I have, rich connections that I have with people we have all helped each other to soar through this time. So that's one thing. I looked at what's going on in the world, and I bring to you a particular story. As a musician, as a creative, dealing with not only music creation, but the politics of music creation. Westminster commissioned me for a Readings and Carols. Their Readings and Carols, a very historic, traditional event at Westminster that they do every year. Of course, most everything happened virtually. They commissioned me and asked me to write a setting of Silent Night, but they wanted me to do it in the Waddles way. The subject of my dissertation, Thomas Whitfield, who was the Dean of Contemporary Gospel Music. I'm actually preparing a book project about him now. Nice. Prepared a setting with the company of Silent Night that is absolutely gorgeous. And I said, I can actually adapt this into a large form setting for the choir. And I think it'll be amazing. It is not something that Westminster traditionally does, but I said, this is really going to, I think it'll really build for them. I brought it to the attention of the choir. I was in a 4-part lecture series with them, and I let them hear the reference track. And after I finished, one of the students unmuted themselves on the Zoom, and she said, Dr. Waddles, I don't know if you're aware, but we've actually already heard this. And there was a bit of a heated discussion on Facebook yesterday, And there are those that feel that this piece, this adaptation, this arrangement does not align with the sound of Westminster. And what are your thoughts about that? Now, mind you, this was a younger student, still a student at Westminster, speaking to not only an alumnus, but a former faculty member from the conducting faculty, whose pieces, probably the majority of his output has been published through either Westminster series or Evoking Sound. These are series of GIA, but Westminster subsets, if you will, to tell me that something that I had created did not align with the Westminster sound, a sound to which I would say the majority of them were quite new to. And so I had to completely rearrange my lecture series. And so the next day that I met with them, I used a book called Cast that is in my library right now by Isabel Wilkerson, also the author of The Warmth of Other Suns. And the Cast speaks to the caste system, and it talks about the caste system in India, the caste system in Nazi Germany, and the caste system in the American United States. And I talk about how that caste system is no different from the implicit bias and systematic racism in music education in America. And what happens when you tell a person of color or any minority in the spectrum that their sound doesn't fit? What does that mean when you tell them that? And, maybe they cried and emailed me afterwards. And we had a whole come to Jesus moment, which was so necessary. And mind you, after that, she emailed me and she and others, profusely apologized. And I really believe that they came to a better sense of mind with it. And mind you, once the project was produced, it was a hit. They sounded amazing. The track was amazing. Thousands of views, so it worked.
That's good to hear.
Second part that happens after this is that once it's been posted on Westminster's page on Facebook, there is another alumnus from Westminster who writes in a comment under the post to state that the arrangement was, and I quote, garbage style music, M-U-Z-A-K, that belongs in an elevator. And as an alumnus of Westminster, he was offended that Westminster would even approach music such as this.
It's interesting because what you share originally about the young lady, it's almost good that she said something like this rather than keeping it in, because you then put on your educator hat and and taught and changed perspectives of students who would otherwise maybe not see that perspective because it's just not in their sphere. But it's harder to establish that kind of education outside of the classroom setting, for instance, with a random Facebook person who and honestly didn't sound random, sounded like the connection to Westminster was obviously there, which is also problematic. How do you find that you have to educate outside of the classroom?
All the time. And one of the more important concepts for me in this time of pandemic, in this time of virtual atmosphere, is we're not in a classroom. I teach from right here in this chair. And so the structure of the four walls is gone. And so what Wayne University and I did, I came up with a concept called Wayne Redefined with my choirs. And the concept is that we are reestablishing the choral ensemble concept. And I brought in various figures, natives of Detroit, who specialized in background vocals, music theater, gospel, the spiritual. And these Zoom sessions were live streamed to Facebook. And so we're having conversations inside the classroom, but this classroom experience is now set as an invitation to all.
Sure, it's not you to those 30 feet in front of you of students. It's you to those 3,000 miles of people who want to view this.
Absolutely. I think about it the same way, TMEA, Allstate. And they chose one of my pieces, Right in the Chariot. And they wanted me to do a virtual Q&A session with the students. And they said, Dr. Waddles, generally, we only get maybe 100 or so students because Texas, as large as it is, you're having, students are having to drive from hours and hours away to get to this one central location. Because of the pandemic, because everything's virtually set, we've got over 500 students on this call.
Silver linings in everything, I suppose. That's incredible.
Accessibility. And that is the overarching concept, being an accessible educator, being an accessible creator, making sure that music education creates for accessibility to students. We teach these music educators all to teach that from the basis, the caste system, if I can relate back to that, the caste system in music education places the Western European classical canon at the top. Sure. And everything else has to come up. We dumb down our own music by saying that it has to reach up to the standard of Western European. And why is that? Well, I tell them most of the time that much of American music has its basis in Black and African music. And if as a music educator, you find that something if as a music educator, you find that to be something you can't deal with, then no, you're not going to teach about it. Yeah.
That's problematic to even think that concept. If that is problematic for you as a teacher, then
think about how many teachers are teaching with that mindset, and they're teaching students of color that. They're teaching students of color to teach that to other people. Sure. It's like slave mentality.
How do you find? Because it does sound like it all relates back to those blinders. This sense of linear thought that is not. It doesn't sound like it's the healthiest way to go about it. How do you find a way to remove the blinders in your teaching styles for your students?
I use everything that I've come with. I refer to it as the gumbo effect. I just think that there are so many different ways that I can approach Bach. There's so many different ways that I can approach Herbert Howells. There's so many different ways that I can approach Verdi. I just have a wealth of different performative and creative experiences and writing experiences that I can bring into the classroom so that I'm not just bringing Bach to elementary school students and saying, here's Bach, have at it. I can get them to, I can get middle schoolers to enjoy a Bach motet by reaching out to something that they listen to every day.
Sure.
Just on their way to school.
That's important to find that kind of relation to bring relevance to everything, to hopefully everyone. I just wanted to check if there's anything else in particular that you'd like to share with the viewers here.
You know what? I just encourage everybody to continue to be human in their living, their everyday living, and continue to be human in the music that you create. I have been so adamant with my students and with everybody that I talk to about finding the human in the score. You know, if I talk about the spiritual, you know, I say that there has to be some historical understanding of why the spiritual as an entire genre was created. But if I want to get into the meat of why somebody in the field or in the cabin or wherever they were had nothing else but to moan out, you know, a spiritual like city called heaven, or to rejoice and sing, you know, Joshua fit the battle of Jericho and the walls come tumbling down. You know, why did that human feel the need to create that? There's a human. There's not just the entire grouping of the enslaved African or the African slave. You know, there's a human in there. And when we find validity in the human, then you will find validity in the art. And then your art and your creativity will be it will mean all the much more. That's my word. Yeah.
Brandon, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your artistic and your lived experience with our viewers. We'd like to remind everyone who's watching to check out Dr. Brandon Waddles' website or follow the links that'll be attached in the video to learn more about Brandon and his work. Thank you for listening, everybody, and we hope to see you again soon.